I'm spiritual nerd, Tommy Hayden. You might remember me from such videos as this one and the previous one. And yes, that was yet another Simpsons reference. That's two Simpsons references to start off two separate and sequential videos. As Maui would say, you're welcome. And yes, I know that I just mixed a Simpsons reference with a Disney reference. But Fox is now owned by Disney, so I'm pretty sure it's okay. Welcome back, and thank you for tuning into my video series, Rise from Fear into Love. This is video number 2, The Master Plan. If you stumbled onto this particular video, I encourage you to go back to video number 1 and start from there. These videos are intended to be sequential, with each one building on concepts explored in previous videos. So, it's best to do as Lewis Carroll suggested, and begin at the beginning. Go on until you come to the end, then stop. You can find links to the first video in the description box below. With that said, we've got a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. As I mentioned in video number 1, you could alternatively consider me atheist or agnostic for my first 42 trips around the sun. My world was equally divided between the artistic side of my nature and the logic and reason side of my nature. My religion, if you want to call it that, was science. I liked science because, unlike religion, which is based in faith, science is based on evidence and was dedicated to making the unknown known. When it came to God, I always figured that given enough time, science would explain God, thus rendering God ultimately unnecessary. However, one of the limitations of science is that you can't prove a negative. So, you can't prove that God doesn't exist. You can just say that we didn't find him over here, if you even knew what you were looking for to begin with. As it turns out, the concept of God varies, depending on whom you talk to, almost as if the concept of God is subjective, which is a topic we'll also discuss at length during these videos, by the way. And besides, the burden of proof is on the believer, not the doubter, so I was quite content to leave the possibility open. But I had no desire to believe in any all-powerful creator, much less one of the religious variety, as I mentioned in my last video. I always enjoyed the celestial teapot analogy posed by Bertrand Russell. If you haven't heard it, it goes something like this. There exists a teapot orbiting the sun, somewhere between Earth and Mars, and is small enough so that none of our telescopes can detect it. Without evidence of the teapot existing, I expect everyone to take me seriously, and to believe in it simply because it's written down in this here book. It would be foolhardy for me to believe something without evidence simply because it's written in a book. But likewise, it would be foolhardy for me to discount evidence simply because there is no scientific explanation for it. Science is wonderful, and is an amazing way to understand the physical world. Unfortunately, one of the other limitations of science is that it basically tells us that if something can't be measured or weighed, then it doesn't exist. This is clearly an incorrect statement. We all experience love, but love obviously can't be measured or weighed. Sure, you can measure serotonin levels or cortisol levels or whatever physical effect you like, but that's not love. That's chemistry. Let's say that you were able to determine the biological state of someone who's deeply, madly in love. Then you were to put that same person in a room with someone they despise and duplicate those same physical or chemical symptoms. Would they be deeply, madly in love with that person? Probably not. They might feel more loving and compassionate to the person, but they wouldn't be in love. If you've ever been in a new relationship and experienced those first moments when you realized you were in love, then you know through your own experience during that time that you're generally happier and kinder to people, but you're still only in love with that one person, even though all the same chemicals are coursing through your body. You would have experienced that those chemicals will make you smile more and be nicer to your annoying coworker, but won't make you fall in love with them. If it were as simple to make someone fall in love with you as mixing up a chemical compound that altered someone's body or brain chemistry and administering it with the correct dosage, then love potions would be sold everywhere, and everyone would be dangerously paranoid about creepy neighbors, skeevy coworkers, and both the patrons and bartenders of the local watering hole. Drink containers with integrated love potion testers would be the #1 selling item on Amazon. So clearly, there's something else going on here. And what about thoughts? Can you weigh or measure a thought? What about a memory? Sure, you can scan a brain and watch lobes light up and all that wonderful stuff, but thoughts and memories exist, and yet by scientific reasoning, they don't. How about consciousness? Same deal. By the way, this is what science calls the hard problem. Where does consciousness reside? The scientific materialist's idea is that everything is atoms. They all randomly clump together for a reason which we can't determine as of yet, and somehow that clump of matter becomes alive, and then once a brain is created, the brain somehow produces consciousness. This despite the fact that scientists have no evidence of consciousness being generated in the brain. We can disrupt consciousness easily enough, whether through a chemical compound such as a general anesthetic, or the old-fashioned way of beaming someone with, say, something larger than a banana but smaller than a piano. But we have very little knowledge of how it's created or where it resides. If you ask a consciousness researcher, and yes, they have those, they'll tell you, just give us time, we'll find it. Which is a fancy scientific way of saying that they're committed to believing that something exists. In this case, consciousness in the brain. That can't be proven and that they have no evidence of. And despite this lack of evidence, they think that everyone else should believe it too. It's the consciousness researchers' version of the celestial teapot. And not only does that sound pretty dogmatic to me, it definitely seems like the same thing they're giving the religionists a hard time about. I have a different idea. Follow the evidence. Let's go back to love for a minute. If someone were to ask you, how do you know when you're in love? What would be your answer? Like most people, your answer would probably be something along the lines of, you know when you know. Or, if you have to ask, then you're not in love. In other words, there are certain things in the world that exist, but they exist experientially. I can talk about what a strawberry tastes like for days on end, but until you actually eat the strawberry, in other words, experience it, you won't know what it actually tastes like. The same thing is true for emotions, thoughts, and consciousness. We directly experience emotions, thoughts, and consciousness, so therefore we know they exist, and yet science has no way of weighing or measuring them. So according to science, they don't exist. Or is it possible that direct experience gives us a way to understand something for which science has no tools to discover? It was really here that my journey began. I wanted to take what the spiritualists said, and see if I could directly experience them for myself, as evidence that these things were real, valid things, and not some airy-fairy, hippy-dippy, woo-woo spiritual mumbo-jumbo. The basic scientific method is to come up with a hypothesis, design a way to test it, get a result, and either adjust your test to get a different result, or adjust your hypothesis to match the results. Then you need to see if you can replicate your results, and hopefully use these results to predict what will happen in the future. So the idea behind this scientific method is testability, repeatability, and predictability. The only difference was that due to their very nature, my tests would have to be experiential rather than concrete. But I was pretty sure that I could figure out a few things that would be testable, repeatable, and possibly predictable. The first test that I ran was to see if I could get a sign from spirit, if I was spiritually headed in the right direction. Like a sign on the side of the highway that said California, 160 miles this way. It was simple. I set an intention. I said out loud to spirit, whatever that was, remember I was still an atheist at the time, that I wanted a sign that the spiritual information I was reading about at the time was accurate. And to make things tricky, I wanted the sign to be something difficult, something I wouldn't encounter in my daily life. I didn't want an animal like a bird or even a dinosaur, since I figured I might see a kid with a dinosaur on the shirt, and that's pretty common, so that would be too easy. I also work with and stare at numbers every day, so I didn't want it to be a number like 12 or 333 or something, because there was a good chance that I would encounter that one too. Okay, Spirit, I said, if I'm on the right path, and the things that I'm learning about are accurate, show me the symbol for infinity. My reasoning was that I would never encounter an infinity symbol in daily life, since I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd seen one out running free and wild in nature, roaming the wild plains of British Columbia, as it were. So I figured that was a pretty safe bet. However, life has a pretty good sense of humor, and within 24 hours I happened to be listening to an audiobook. And the narrator said that the computer server they were building had to be able to scale to infinity. My ears perked up, and as if to confirm, the narrator repeated, "That's right, it has to scale to infinity." Apparently, I was onto something. And yet, that still wasn't an infinity symbol. So, again, I spoke out loud. "Okay, Spirit, that's close. But I want to see the infinity symbol." And just a few hours later, stopped at a red light, I looked over. There, in the twilight of the early morning, was an illuminated sign on the side of a building. And there it was, as crisp and as clear as day. A corporate logo that contained an infinity symbol. I think I was definitely onto something. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I had 42 years of scientific thinking at my disposal, and there was a part of me that was saying, okay, hearing the word infinity twice and seeing an illuminated sign of an infinity symbol in 24 hours after you've asked for it is cool and all, but what if it's just the reticular activating system? Now, of course, you're asking, what is the reticular activating system? And I'm glad you asked. If you didn't know, your senses are being flooded with data all day long. The reticular activating system is the part of the brain that creates filters and drops unimportant data for important stuff, like, say, a charioteer on a blue and gold chariot being pulled by a zebra, rumbling like thunder down Mulberry Street. It's the reason why when you decide to buy a red sports car, you start seeing red sports cars everywhere. Or when you learn a new word, you hear people using it more often. That's not mysticism, that's science. We'll discuss this topic more in video number 4 when we break down the law of attraction. But for now, please indulge me while I continue my story. I figured I had to go deeper. I had to figure out a way to test something more challenging. And so, inspired by some of the books I'd been reading at the time, and the common spiritual understanding that we're spiritual beings having a human experience, I decided to try to do something that I thought was more than a little bit weird. I started training myself to have conscious, out-of-body experiences, which some people would refer to as astral projection. I prefer the term out-of-body experiences, or OBEs, since it's a little more scientific and less woo-woo than astral projection. But functionally, it's kind of the same thing. It's a little like chickpeas and garbanzo beans are the same thing. But I digress. Over the next 6 or so months, I watched a couple of YouTube videos, read a few blog posts, and practiced late at night before I went to bed. And then it happened. One night, while drifting in and out of sleep, what I later learned was called the hypnagogic state, a key state in having out-of-body experiences, I got shook. Literally. My body began vibrating violently. Like, violently. The best analogy I can use is it was like when the comic book character The Flash vibrates his molecules so that he can pass through solid matter. It kind of felt like that. Additionally, my heart was beating so fast that I felt like if it went on much longer, that it would explode, and I would probably die. It took everything I could just to try and breathe and relax. When the vibration subsided, I looked over at my wife, a late sleeper, still sleeping in bed next to me. Whatever had happened, other than the rapid heartbeat, it was definitely non-physical. Having calmed down, and after stopping my mind from racing, I finally fell asleep. Once I awoke the next day, I began searching the web for out-of-body experiences and vibrations, and I found out that the vibrational state is actually quite common just prior to out-of-body experiences, and is sometimes accompanied by a sound not unlike the roar of a train going by your ear. Thankfully, I didn't get the roar, but I did experience some pretty massive vibrations. When I settled in the following night, I tried again. Once again, I hit the vibrational stage, this time not as intense as the night before, but still enough that I figured I must be on the right track. I just needed to figure out how to actually exit my body. And at least I had confirmation that the previous night wasn't a dream or an aberration. Over the course of the next month or so, I learned more and I practiced more until I finally achieved my first conscious out-of-body experience. And I'll tell you, the experience of floating up out of your body is a very real one. You instantly and completely know with absolute certainty that who you are is here, several feet above what you thought was you, your body, down there on the bed. I had about a half a dozen other out-of-body experiences, including one while sitting in meditation, before I ended my experiments. I had all the evidence I needed. It was testable, repeatable, and predictable. And it was clear that the me that is commonly thought of as me is just a body. My thoughts, my memories, my personality are, or at least can be, all separate from the body. And if the me that is me is not in the physical body and can just as easily pass through a wall or a ceiling, then what am I? Where am I? Who am I? Maybe the spiritualists were right. Maybe I am a spirit that has a body, and not a body that has a spirit. My out-of-body experiences had given me enough evidence to know that the body and the mind/personality are two different things, existing on differing planes of reality. But I wanted to know more, and quite honestly, I didn't want to have to go through the trouble of performing the experiments myself. I have a job, a wife, and 2 kids. My time is limited enough without spending months on end conducting experiments in the non-physical. Besides, my out-of-body experiences were still brief and predominantly out of my control, which is to say that they happened to me rather than at my command. And while I had figured out that the astral body was not the soul, I still had no real idea what the soul was, if it even existed. So I took a shortcut. I knew I wasn't the only one who had had these experiences. After all, I was reading blog posts and watching videos from people who had claimed to be having the same experiences. So I started seeking out people who had numerous experiences to see what their experiences were and how mine contrasted with theirs. In the field of out-of-body experiences, there is a seminal classic called Journeys Out of the Body by Robert Monroe, one of the earliest modern writers on the subject. I say modern because spiritual texts throughout history have written about them. The Bible has several examples. One in Corinthians, saying, "I know not whether it was in the body or out of it." And Revelations, saying, "I was in spirit on the day of the Lord," which both reference the ability to go out of body and into spirit. The Yoga Sutras mention out-of-body experiences, and I'm partial to believing that Muhammad's night journey in the Quran, given the distance traveled and his experiences, was likely an astral journey. However, unlike the brief and usually misinterpreted descriptions in spiritual texts, Monroe fully describes many of his out-of-body experiences over several decades, including evidence for why they had to be real. In one example, he's flying to the house of a friend who lives in the next city. And as he's flying above the city streets, he sees a garage with a car parked in front and a mechanic working on the car. When he comes back into his body, he jumps in his car and drives over and sees the same car parked out front of the same garage with a mechanic working on it. In another example, he ends up in a friend's kitchen and sees his friend's wife dealing out what looked like oversized playing cards to the people around the table. Upon questioning his friend later, he found out that his friend's wife was sorting out the mail and handing it out to each person at the table at the time Monroe would have been in their kitchen. Monroe goes on to describe several situations which he can explain. He describes 3 times in which he ended up in an ever-present field of love and unity, filled with music and light of such beauty that he never wanted to leave. He mentions being the presence of the Creator, and that in this state, the existence of the Creator is obvious. He describes the experiences as the feeling of being home. Each time, he says, he was unwillingly removed, and after each time he felt a sense of homesickness for weeks afterwards. So powerful were the experiences, he said, that at the time of writing Journeys, he had never tried to go back. Now, he would eventually go back one more time, which I'll get into later in this video series. But for now, All you need to know is that what he described caused in me a revelation. An image of the master plan formed in my head. Monroe didn't know where he had gone, but I did. I knew through my own experience that the mind existed in a non-physical realm, along with an associated non-physical or astral body. And the physical body existed in a physical realm, which both occupied the same space, interpermeating each other, simply existing at different vibrational frequencies. This explained why separating the astral body from the physical body required a vibrational shift to move from one dimension to another. The vibrational phase I went through when I learned to astral project, which lessened as I became better at adjusting to the required frequencies, was part of the shifting of my consciousness to another body and detaching it from the physical, where it resides during the waking state. What appeared to happen was that instead of shifting into the realm of the mind, Monroe went further, deeper into the non-physical realm, increasing his vibrational frequency and bringing his personality self into the realm of the soul, or spirit. So now I knew that I had a body, and I knew that I had a mind, and through Monroe's descriptions, I knew that I had a soul, or spirit, that was always in the presence of the Creator, and always existing in an infinite field of love, unity, and compassion. And I knew that all of these were connected, again, interpermeating each other, all existing in the same place, but shifted dimensionally and vibrationally. Each piece was part of the whole and created for a specific purpose. There was no separation, simply a vibrational attunement and an intent to shift the consciousness or awareness between bodies. As someone with a scientific mind, I could believe that the physical universe could have arisen by accident, if the physical universe was all there was. It could have been random chance, that we just ended up in a universe where all the switches and dials worked out so that we now exist as humans on this little blue marble we call home. But seeing that there was clearly a soul, a mind, and a body, and all three had their own realms, and that all three were eternally connected, and all working together in the physical and the non-physical for a reason and a purpose, and to see the divine perfection of the system, the intricacy, and the impossible complexity of it, while balanced with the absolute simplicity of the system, there was no way that I could possibly think that this was an accident. What appeared in my head was the master plan. What I added to the master plan was at the top, God, the Creator, Source, the Divine. And I didn't add it because Monroe wrote that in the spirit realm the presence of the Creator was obvious. I added it because when I looked at the whole picture, I couldn't accept that a system so perfectly designed, existing both physically and non-physically, could be an accident. It was a concept too big for my mind to handle. And I don't know, maybe you're different. But I'm pretty sure my actual response to this revelation was, crap, now I gotta believe in God. And as an atheist, you can imagine how long this took me to integrate. So this revelation that I received understandably rocked my world for a little while. But after a lot of deep breaths, long walks, and a number of minor mental breakdowns, I finally began in earnest a new life that somehow contained an all-powerful Creator. And I will admit that that's not really the outcome I wanted to come to as an atheist. But I suppose it could have been worse, although I don't really know how. I'm pretty sure that the discovery that an all-powerful Creator governs the universe is about the worst thing that can happen to an atheist. But at the very least, now I had an interesting story to tell. So, yay for me, I guess. Anyway, let's take a dive into the master plan so that we can start to answer the Douglas Adams questions of life, the universe, and everything, and determine if 42 is actually the correct answer. Spoiler alert, it isn't, but it works great if you're into dry British comedy. At its core, the master plan is quite simple. The master plan is, simply put, God's plan. It's the story of creation in a diagram. That's it. It outlines the greatest mysteries of mankind, who we really are, what we're doing here, and the meaning of life. It's not too bad if you're into that kind of thing. In a minute, we're going to go back into my own experiences. But before we go deep, we need to understand that the master plan isn't a perfect interpretation. It's not intended to be, nor could it be if it wanted to be. It is a simplified version of the creation story and functions in some small way as a guideline or a map. And as they say in NLP parlance, the map is not the territory. Any map is a representation of a given territory, not the territory itself. In this case, the territory that the map represents is a concept, and any concept, by definition, has to be less than the thing itself. So, the master plan is a map of the territory. Source is both divinely simple, yet infinitely complex. So this is just the stretch of creation that concerns us as humans. In my explorations on this topic, I went from the bottom up, moving from the physical up into the non-physical. But for the sake of explanation, we'll do it from the top down. If you haven't had my experiences, which obviously you haven't, don't worry that I'm not scientifically proving the existence of God at this point. Right now, we're just talking about the master plan. We'll prove the existence of God in the next video. But for now, just bear with me. So at the top, we find God, or source. I use the two words interchangeably, and usually use the word source when I think that the word God would freak people out a little, or because the word God has been tainted with religious ideology. And yes, I do realize I just said taint. And that does make me laugh, because I'm a child. But since we're using words that different people will have different meanings for, we need to define what I mean by source, or God. And for once, I'm going to attempt something in the way of brevity by skipping past the details and just moving to the conclusion that I came to, rather than showing you the math. When I refer to God, I don't mean some old dude with a beard sitting on a mountaintop or on a cloud waiting for Judgment Day. God is the omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, and eternal source energy of love, life, and consciousness. God is a field of energy. God is by its very nature formless and boundless. God is all that is, the allness, the oneness, and the source from which all is created and arises. We'll discuss God's nature more in the next video, video number 3 on love versus ego. But for now, to understand the master plan, you should understand that God, as the ever-present field of consciousness, desires to know itself. As consciousness, God asks the same eternal questions that we, as beings who are part of that conscious energy, ask, including, who am I? Why am I here? And what's the meaning of all of this? As luck would have it, God has the benefit of being essentially omnipotent. So God devised a system in which it could know itself. The system, of course, is very simple, and it's wonderfully described in the book series Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh. Simply put, in the absence of that which is not, that which is not. Which means, for example, that God cannot know itself as the all of it unless it's also not the all of it, and can compare and contrast all versus not all. So God splits himself into many pieces, which we call souls. Each has the same abilities as the Creator. Souls exist in a realm of infinite love and compassion, as described in Monroe's book that we just outlined. Each soul is an individuated version of the Creator, separate yet always connected to the whole, and pretty darn equal in creative power. However, since the soul knows who it is at all times and is constantly in the presence of the Creator, that presents an issue. The goal is for the soul to experience, like the Creator, that which it is, but in the absence of what it is not, it can't do that. To once again draw an analogy from Conversation with God, it's like being a candle in the sun. How can you know yourself as the light if light is all there is? You must first create the darkness in order to know yourself as light. And you must remove yourself from the sun and experience the darkness to understand yourself as light. But, of course, the soul is always in the light, always in the presence of the Creator. So the soul creates a mind, which is imbued with a personality self, designed to be ignorant of its true nature, so that it can eventually come back into knowingness with its true nature, love. It is through this method that the mind can create things which are truly horrific or fearful, and thus experience and feel the disconnect between the experience of its true nature and that which it is not. If the mind knew who it was, the jig would be up. And in fact, That's what you find with awakened people, that much of the fear goes away, and your only goal really becomes to move further and further into alignment with who you really are. So the mind exists in a different realm, which I call the metaphysical realm. Of course, these are all my terms, and may differ from others who describe similar states. Others have referred to the metaphysical as the etheric realm, or the astral plane, or the physio-spiritual. In the metaphysical realm, your form is really up to you, to a large degree. To interact with other minds, typically a body of some kind is created, although the form is much more fluid and changeable via your thoughts. Different areas are available to explore, depending on your vibrational resonance or frequency. Lower vibrational beings exist at lower frequencies, and typically have darker, more distorted, demonic appearances. Higher vibrational beings, such as ascended masters, angels, and archangels, exist at higher frequencies, and their forms are typically brighter and more powerful. When existing in the non-physical, that is to say, out of body, most people land somewhere in the middle, not too high and not too low. We'll discuss this topic more in video number 5, by the way. But in order to experience life to its fullest, you need a body, and for that you need to go into the physical realm. Not all souls take physical bodies, but many do. Life in the body isn't easy, but it has great joy to it. How can you know healing in the absence of sickness? How can you feel connected without something that makes you feel separated? How can you feel satisfied without something that would make you feel unsatisfied? How can you know your unlimited true nature unless you experience that which is inherently limited? So the mind creates a body so that it can experience that which it already knows by experiencing that which it is not. Like the metaphysical realm, the physical realm is organized by vibration, which we call emotions. Just as each color of the rainbow has its own frequency and vibration, emotions likewise have their own frequency and vibration. Higher vibrational energy, such as love and bliss, focus your energy upwards, and lower vibrational energy, such as guilt, shame, anger, or jealousy, focus your energy downwards. You'll notice that these actually have a physical effect on your body. High vibrational energy lifts you upwards, putting a spring in your step, lifting your chest and chin, raising the corners of your mouth, and opening your eyes wider. Lower vibrational energy pulls your shoulders down, lowers your head and the corners of your mouth, and roots your feet to the ground. All these realms are really one realm, with a shift in vibration and a lessening of density as you move upwards from the physical, and an increase of density as you move downwards from the spiritual. As you move downwards into the physical, the amount of power you have immediate access to decreases. And as you tune into the non-physical, your power increases. Essentially, we create downwards and evolve upwards. I say essentially because that's how it appears in this chart. We'll discuss creation and evolution a little later in this video. The process is a cycle, with the soul conceiving, the mind creating, and the body experiencing. This creation process moves downwards in our diagram from the non-physical into the physical, and then as we have experiences which attune ourselves to our true nature, we move further and further back into connection from the physical into the non-physical. Each of the 3 main parts of you uses their own language. The soul speaks to you in feelings, the mind speaks to you in thoughts, and the body speaks in words. Physicality is the slowest form of vibrational energy, and words are the lowest form of communication. Conversely, the highest form of communication is feeling. This is how spirit speaks to us. Those who are sufficiently in tune with the metaphysical can communicate through thought transference, much like a radio broadcast, to anyone who is receptive, much like a radio receiver. However, thought transference is basically done more like a block of thought, or an image, which is then interpreted by the receiver. It's more accurate than words because a fuller picture can be transmitted in a shorter period of time with fewer miscommunications. This is, by the way, how psychics communicate with the non-physical. The non-physical offers or transmits a block of thought to the psychic, or receiver, which the psychic interprets with their own words and utilizing their own life experience as a filter. If the non-physical presents the receiver with information that the receiver can't process and doesn't understand, the receiver can't do their job, which is why Neale Donald Walsh's works are filled with Catholic philosophy. and Abraham Hicks's works are devoid of any religious undertones. Walsh grew up as a Catholic, while Esther Hicks has no religious terminology in her vocabulary. It's much the same way as if you only have a rudimentary knowledge of Italian, and someone wants you to translate Italian into English, and then start speaking Italian rapidly to you. You're going to stumble and not be able to communicate properly. Now, because I just brought psychics into the conversation, I want to make a couple of quick points before we move on. In order to do what psychics do, the first thing they need to do is release any resistance to receiving information, which means they have to step out of their ego. And the other thing they will generally do, because they want to do their jobs well, is to set their intention that the information that is received is for the highest good for all people involved. These two ideas will be explored in depth in the next video, but it should be obvious that using your psychic gifts to enrich yourself at the expense of others is not generally for the highest good. If a psychic were to do this, it would drop the psychic back into their ego, which shuts down their connection to the non-physical, which is why you don't often see psychics winning the lottery. It's a bit like changing the radio station from classic rock to country and still expecting classic rock to come out. It just doesn't work that way, so I thought I'd clear that up. And now, let's continue with the topic of communication. Since we live most of our lives in the physical, our primary form of communication are words. Unfortunately, words kind of suck when it comes to communication. Most people will be able to tell you that communication is as much nonverbal as it is verbal. I don't know if it's as specific as the 7% verbal, 93% nonverbal concept that's usually thrown around, but it's pretty obvious that words communicate better when combined with body language and tonality. One of the reasons I'm presenting this information in video form is specifically so that you can hear my tonality and see my body language, or what little of it you can. Anyone who's read a fiction story knows that 90% of it is exposition, explaining the scene and informing the reader of how something was said. Knowing that a character raised his hand to his forehead and asked quizzically gives the reader a much different understanding than if somebody slumped down in a chair and said something regretfully or with a pained expression. We also know how easy it is to misinterpret a text or an email because someone didn't add in the required emoji. Naturally, the inaccuracy of language is one of my biggest issues with any holy text. Words are, quite frankly, the worst way to communicate. Perhaps a string of emojis would work better, but who knows? Anyway, leaving aside for the moment translation and retranslation errors, our holiest texts often leave out this crucial information of tonality and body language, leaving a lot open to interpretation. Even worse, they're typically a collection of words on a page, organized by some politically motivated governing body, and usually announced as unquestionable by that same governing body. And yet, these same words, which are determined to be the one true word of God, are quite often misinterpreted, misunderstood, or misused. Why is it that one person can read the words of the Bible, the Quran, or the Bhagavad Gita, and find inspiration, and another person can read the same words and find a way to justify war? Different people interpret the same words differently. If I ask you to picture a dog or a tree, each person would picture a different dog or a different tree. That picturing would generate an experience, perhaps a memory of the dog you grew up with, or your neighbor's dog that barks in the middle of the night, keeping you awake. You might picture an apple tree in your backyard, or the Bodhi tree that the Buddha sat under when he achieved enlightenment. I once referred to a friend of mine as a lady, which to me is a compliment, meaning a woman of stature and class. She was immediately offended, because to her, lady meant lady of the night, and she had felt that I had just called her a prostitute. Same word, different experience. And if everyone has a different experience with words, then that means that words themselves are a subjective experience, including the holiest ones. Jesus' famous words, "I and the Father are one," mean one thing to a Christian, and another thing entirely to an awakened individual. In the Christian's case, it is a statement of Jesus' divinity. In an awakened individual, it is a statement of everyone's divinity. So words themselves are inherently subjective, limited, and often misinterpreted or mistranslated, and that makes them incredibly hard to trust. And if we can't trust the Word, what can we trust? The answer is simple. Once we recognize that words are subjective, we can then throw any absolute Word of God out the window and simply look to our feelings and our intuitions as guidance, and compare and contrast them with our experiences in the physical to determine the subjective truth for ourselves. We'll talk more about this in the next video, video 3. But for now, my suggestion is that when the so-called Word of God conflicts with your own direct experience, or your intuitions and feelings, set aside the Word and trust in your intuition. Trust in your experience. Jesus spoke directly of his experience as a divine being. Buddha spoke directly of his experience with enlightenment. The Prophet Muhammad spoke earnestly of his own direct experience hearing the Word of God. Again, don't take anyone's word just because it's written in a book. Any book. Seek out your own experiences. That's what you came into the physical for. But enough about words. Let's get back to the master plan. All these realms are one realm. There is no separation in any of it. All things are one thing. Changing your vibrational rate or frequency attunes you to different aspects of creation. Much like tuning the radio in your car brings you into attunement or alignment with different radio stations. This is a constant cycle of energy, moving from one form to another. Faster and slower, up and down. Constantly in movement, constantly in transition, constantly in a state of being and becoming. Creation is a contractive or outside-in process, taking the high-flying energy of the spirit or soul and focusing it inward and slowing it down to the point where it can take physical form. Thus, God contains all souls. A soul contains the mind. A mind contains the body. Or, said in reverse, the body is contained within the mind is contained within the soul, and the soul is contained within God, or Source. It's a process of moving from unity into duality, from formlessness into form, from omniscience into ignorance, and from knowing something as a concept to experiencing that in physicality, and then back again. Evolution is the creative process in reverse, an expansive or inside-out process. In other words, creation and evolution are one and the same thing. Evolution is the process of creation. So yes, both the creationists and the evolutionists are right, but they're both looking at opposite sides of the same coin, each one claiming that they're right and the other one is wrong. This type of dualistic black and white thinking is something that we'll explore further in the next video. But for now, simply understand that the universe and everything in it was created by a creator, and everything within that creation evolves. Again, this is plainly obvious when you examine us as creators. We are, after all, pieces of the greater creator, made in its image and likeness. First, we create the idea of a mousetrap. Then we pull in the resources we need to create it. Then we birth it out into physicality. Then we evolve the idea and make a better mousetrap. This process of evolution goes on until we create a mousetrap that is everything we could ever imagine a mousetrap to be. First, we focus our attention inward, creating the idea of what we want to paint on a canvas. Then we pull in or gather the necessary resources to create that painting. Then we birth that idea out onto the canvas itself and evolve it until we create an image that represents the image that we held in our mind. And I'm sure you can follow the same process for the creation of a physical body or a physical universe. It's a process of contraction and expansion, creation and evolution, repeated over and over again. The master plan is one thing, one system, all of creation in a nutshell. It tells you exactly who you are and who you are in relationship to Source. It gives you an inkling of your true creative power. Of course, as I've said from the outset, you don't have to believe me. You can discover this for yourself. One of the universal truths is that 100% of people who turn their focus inwards to seek their own true nature and commit to truth, setting aside their own dogma and limiting beliefs, will realize the same truth, that there is ultimately only one truth, that there is no separation between you and God. All things are one thing. That one thing is God, and God is love, and you are all of it. That same truth, recognized by every spiritual seeker throughout history, was my realization too. And scientifically, if it's testable, predictable, and repeatable, it's a pretty good bet that there's probably some validity to it. So the master plan is a visual representation of the eternal truth. The self is God, is of God, and doesn't exist without God. It's exactly as the Hindus have said for thousands of years. Atman, the self, and Brahman, God, are one and the same. Jesus put it another way. He said, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. And in case that wasn't clear to you, if you examine the master plan closely enough, you'll also note that you are truly made in the image and likeness of God. God has a soul, the infinite field of love, light, and consciousness, and a mind, often referred to as the Akashic Records, or God's Book of Remembering, and a body, the physical universe. He uses the physical universe to experience that which he is, through us and through every other thing in the universe. And so that about wraps it up on the master plan, the overall system in which we know ourselves. If anything I've said has brought up any questions, please feel free to comment below. Also, if you think this video would be of interest to others, please like, share, comment, or subscribe. In our next video, we're going to examine love, the ego, and how the relationship between the two can fundamentally change your understanding of how our lives and relationships work. We'll understand why our societies can often seem upside down. And after all this talk about God, we're going to attempt to prove God's existence. So stick around. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you soon.